Good morning, everyone, and I guess official good afternoon to those of you joining us from Eastern Time Zone. Welcome to the Council of State Governments Midwestern Legislative Conference webinar series on promoting growth and shared prosperity for a better Midwest. My name is Laura Tamaka, and I serve as the staff liaison for the Midwestern Legislative Conference Economic Development Committee, which is sponsoring today's webinar, along with the MLC Agriculture and Natural Resources Committee. I'm joined today by Carolyn Orr, who is the staff liaison for that committee, as well as my colleagues Jenny and Christina, who will help with the technical side of today's event. Before we get started, I want to review a couple of housekeeping notes that we're all very familiar with in our world of Zoom. But today's webinar is being recorded, and a copy of that recording will be made available later this afternoon on the CSG Midwest website. Please remember to mute your audio when you're not speaking to help reduce the background noise for our attendees. And then as far as the procedure for today, after each presentation, we will take a brief question and comment period. And then at the end of all presentations, we'll engage in larger discussion and be able to circle back to any remaining questions that you might have for any of our presenters. So throughout the webinar, please type your questions in the chat, or during the question time, please raise your hand and we'll call on you to speak. As I previously mentioned, this event is sponsored by the MLC Economic Development Committee and the MLC Agriculture and Natural Resources Committee. And I would first like to thank the respective officers of both of these committees for their work and leadership and guidance that they provide to CSG Midwest in making these panels successful. Joining us for today's event are Representative Whitkey and Representative Manning, both with the Economic Development Committee, and Representative Anderson and Representative Hammond and Senator Marcy Francisco with the Agriculture Committee. And all of them will help lead us through today's proceedings. At this point, I'm going to turn things over to Representative Whitkey from Wisconsin to introduce today's session. Representative?
Thank you, Laura, and thank you to my colleagues on both committees for hosting this event, and to all of you who have joined us today. And a special thank you to our presenters for the time and effort they have put into preparing for today's session. Over the course of the next several weeks, the Economic Development Committee will host a 6-part webinar series promoting growth and shared prosperity for a better Midwest. During the series, this committee will partner with another of the MLC's policy committees to present a virtual event on a topic that we believe is of mutual interest to the committees. Our goal is to examine issues that play a role in the economic health and well-being of our region, and to discuss strategies that will lead to greater prosperity for all of our communities and citizens. And I personally think it's extremely important that we have these sessions because as I scan most of the news from the Midwest, looks like many of us would like to see some positive ideas come out of these sessions that we can bring back to our legislatures. Today we're partnering with the Agriculture and Natural Resources Committee, and I'd like to thank their officers and members for co-hosting this session. Today, we'll look at the state of ethanol production in the Midwest and the role the industry plays in the regional economy, as well as strategies for investing in ethanol, the role of the federal government, and opportunities and challenges for the future of ethanol. I'm not sure if many of you are like myself. I have a significant, agriculture is a significant part of the Wisconsin economy. In my district alone, I have a number of corn growers in the rural part of my district. And I've also been out with many of the corn growers to one of our largest ethanol plants in southwestern Wisconsin. So I look forward to today's session. We have some great presenters lined up to today's discussion. At this point, I am going to turn things over to my colleague from the Minnesota, Representative Paul Anderson, who will further introduce the session.
Thank you, Representative Whitkey, and welcome, folks, to today's web event featuring ethanol. I'm going to begin by saying that ethanol is good for America. It's good for the farmers in this country that grow the corn used to make ethanol. It's good for the economies of the cities and states where ethanol is produced, and it's good for the American consumer and also for the environment. Ethanol's greenhouse gas emissions are between 40 and 50% lower than gasoline. It has reduced the cost of fuel to the consumer, and it has boosted farm income and helped the rural economies and helped all of us in the rural areas of the Midwest. Here's a few quick numbers on ethanol production in America. And these numbers are as of the year 2020 from the US Department of Energy. There are currently 201 ethanol plants in the United States. Plant capacity is approximately 17.4 billion gallons annually, and annual production last year was just under 14 billion gallons. And that, by the way, is the lowest level of production in the past 7 years here in America. And a couple of reasons for that drop in production include the granting of small refinery waivers for blending ethanol and the EPA being a bit late in announcing ethanol volumes as required by the Renewable Fuel Standard. And by the way, that RFS is due to be reset next year in the year 2022. And according to a national statistics agency, ethanol impacts the US economy in these ways. Direct jobs in the ethanol industry, about 62,000. Indirect and induced jobs, another 242,000. Contributions to the GDP in America, $34.7 billion. And household income of those working in the industry, $18.6 billion. And much of that economic activity takes place right here in the Corn Belt and the upper Midwest. So I think we can all agree that ethanol plays an important role in each of our states' economies. And now to get things going, I'm pleased to introduce today's first presenter, Bob Patton with the Minnesota Department of Agriculture. At the MDA, Bob supervises a section that works on the topics of energy, environment, and land use in the Agricultural Marketing and Development Division. He's been with the MDA for about 27 years. And last year, Bob staffed Minnesota's Governor's Council on Biofuels. Bob is going to give us an overview of ethanol in Minnesota and our state's support of and investments in ethanol. Thank you for joining us, Bob, and I think I'll turn things over to you right now. Welcome.
Yes, I think I need to start my video here. Oh, no. Yes, thank you very much, Representative Anderson, and it's an honor to be presenting at this. Okay, my video is excuse me. It's an honor to be presenting at this event, and really an honor to be introduced by you, Representative Anderson, because of your leadership in agriculture and your leadership in biofuels. So I'm going to start off, if you could advance my slide, please, Jenny. I'm going to start off just talking about production in Minnesota and Minnesota firsts. Of course, Minnesota likes to think of itself as above average in all things, and that is true in biofuels as well. The Minnesota model really was one of we were a leader in the first production ethanol plants through the farmer-owned cooperatives of the Minnesota model. We had, in addition to the federal subsidies that were available at that time, we also instituted an ethanol producer incentive payment. It started off as 20 cents per acre, or 20 cents per gallon. It eventually was reduced due to budget cuts, but it did stay in place until the year 2012. We had the first E10 mandate, 10% ethanol in 2003, first in the country. And we also had the first biodiesel mandate in 2005. So 2% biodiesel, B2, that increased to 5%, then 10%. We now stand at 20%, biodiesel mandate for the warm weather months, and it goes down to B5 in the cold weather months. We have the most E85 stations in the nation, and we have the highest blend rate of around 12.5%. Next slide, please. We have 18 ethanol plants. Unfortunately, we had some of them shutter. We had 21 at one point, but we have a production capacity of over 1 billion gallons. Next slide, please. Representative Anderson talked about production and some of the factors that have affected that production. One of the other factors, of course, was the pandemic, and you can see that dramatic effect in 2020. These are weekly averages. Thankfully, there was a big hit economically to ethanol plants, and I believe Troy is going to be talking about that later. But we have had a recovery, and we're over the production that we had previously. Next slide, please. Of course, the reasons, the rationale for support for growing ethanol and biofuels in general, a lot of that had to do with trying energy independence, and of course that was in reaction to the oil crisis that those of us who are old enough remember quite well in the 70s. The other big reason is economic development, which is, of course, the topic of this series of webinars. The farm crisis was a factor, and Minnesota's industry really has been a contribution. Unfortunately, we don't have a new study, but in 2012, the numbers were $5 billion contribution to the state's economy, and over about 12.5 thousand jobs generated by ethanol. Another reason that's not on this slide, though, is environmental. The additive MBTE had been a replacement for lead to increase octane. That was found to have adverse impacts on groundwater, and eventually also was found to be pretty toxic and harmful to human health. So ethanol has been very helpful in that regard. Next slide, please. We have a new challenge today, though, that is also a big reason, and again, Representative Anderson referred to this in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. Climate change is a high priority for the Walz-Flanagan administration in Minnesota, and at the same time, the governor remains very committed to biofuels and very passionate about agriculture and biofuels. Next slide, please. One of the things that was done in the climate arena recently in 2019 was a report by the State Department of Transportation called Pathways to Decarbonizing Transportation in Minnesota. Transportation is now the #1 source of greenhouse gas emissions. And so this report was to look at what we can do. This graphic here, that the top line of that wedge represents essentially the business as usual projection for greenhouse gas emissions from today to 2050. And the bottom line represents the goals, and those are really the you can see those dots on the chart. Those are the Next Generation Energy Act goals that were set in 2007. The other thing to pay attention to is the blue and green bands in this wedge represent electrification and biofuels, and that makes up 80% of the reductions. So, so you can see the green is still a significant wedge in this diagram. If you go to the next slide, please. I think, again, Troy Bredenkamp is going to have a similar slide to this. And these are a little hard to interpret, but really what these charts are showing you is that in terms of the uptake that's expected for electric vehicles, by 2040, and this is just light duty vehicles, we're still half of the, even with aggressive action, half of the fleet that's going to be out there is going to be internal combustion engines. So liquid fuels remain quite important, and that's even more important with medium and heavy duty vehicles. Next slide, please. Given all this, the governor about the same time established the Governor's Council on Biofuels, and you can see the purpose that was in the executive order has to do with the role of biofuels in reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and it was to recommend policy and budget proposals. Next slide, please. These are some of the parts of that executive order that we were supposed to accomplish with the Governor's Council to accelerate. We have what's called the petroleum replacement goals that are in statute. And you can see on the right, the numbers there, we are not meeting. We lead the nation in share of ethanol and gasoline, but we're not anywhere near meeting these goals. Next slide, please. Another consideration was to find a way to incentivize advancement and investment in carbon efficiency in plants and in the feedstock that's used by those plants. Next slide, please. And then to utilize biofuels to reduce GHGs. And again, this is showing the Next Generation Energy Act goals and how we are not meeting them today. Next slide, please. And then also to provide opportunity for farmers, rural communities, the natural environment, and economically disadvantaged populations, and to look at the feasibility and cost of biofuels infrastructure. Next slide, please. So the recommendations that the Governor's Council came up with really fell into 5 buckets. And higher blends, infrastructure, low carbon fuel standards, state fleet, public information marketing, and advanced biofuels. Next slide, please. 3 of these really, the way the council thought about these is they really thought of what were short-term goals and long-term goals. And so the short-term goals had to do with getting to higher blends, particularly E15, and the infrastructure needed for that. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later. Also, more biofuels use in the state fleet, and that is yet to be accomplished, but we will be doing that through an executive order. And then public information and marketing. Next slide, please. In terms of infrastructure, the problem is that the estimate of our pollution control agency is that even though we have made quite an investment and made a lot of headway through our grant programs to get higher blends and a compatible infrastructure on the ground, we still stand at about 85% of our stations that don't have proper infrastructure for safely delivering E15 or higher blends. And so one of the main recommendations of the council was a financial assistance program that would be continuing with a long-term funding source. We have a start at that, and again, thanks to Representative Anderson's work and others, we have a new grant program that has $3 million per year. Plus, we're very pleased that the Minnesota corn growers are gifting $1 million. So we'll have $7 million for the biennium for infrastructure. Next slide, please. So this is just a statement that from the council that they adopted, that moving toward from 10 to 15 was a near-term policy priority for them. And so I think that's all I need to say there. Next slide, please. The longer term policy priorities have to do with a low carbon fuel standard, also known as a clean fuel policy, and also known as a clean fuel standard, and advanced biofuels. And I'll go into each of those a little bit. Next slide, please. Just recently, the governor announced that we would be exploring a low carbon fuel standard, or we're calling it a clean fuel standard. And this is really on the background or on the foundation that's been set for a couple years, several years now, of an effort that's been run by the Great Plains Institute here in Minnesota for a Midwest clean fuels policy. And so that effort has included not only Minnesota, but Iowa and Nebraska, and I believe Illinois as well. And that process continues. There was a white paper that was issued in 2020 that outlined the principles for that. We're exploring this through first starting off with stakeholder meetings with the various groups, including agriculture, environment groups, and so forth. Next slide, please. For those of you that aren't familiar with low carbon fuel standards or clean fuel standards, California, Oregon, and Washington currently have standards like this. Also, they're used in Europe. And it's a performance and also a market-based program to reduce greenhouse gases from all fuels. And that includes electricity, but biofuels as well. And it's based on what's called life cycle carbon accounting. In fuels, that's often called well to wheels. And so it's really all phases from extraction to production to use to eventual disposal of fuels. And the measure that's used is called a carbon intensity score, or CI. And the next graphic, next slide, please, will show a little bit how this works. There's a standard is established for carbon intensity of fuels. And so refiners and fuel distributors have to have to gradually lower the carbon intensity of fuel. Fuels that are above the standard, that are produced that are above the standard, need credits. They develop a deficit and need to earn credits in a market. And fuels that are below have a better carbon intensity, such as biofuels or electric cars, are able to generate credits in the market to sell to those obligated parties that need those credits. And so that this is usually done at the manufacturer and wholesale blender and wholesale level. Next slide, please. Then another big part of the longer term recommendations of the council have to do with really more funding for an existing program we've had since 2015 called the Bioincentive Program. And it actually works exactly the same way as the old ethanol producer incentive program, and in fact is based partially on the funding that used to be devoted to that. And as you can see on the slide here, it's a production incentive not only for biofuels, but for bioproducts essentially, and bioenergy, renewable chemicals, biomass thermal energy. But we do have incentives for advanced biofuel. And right now the incentives are going to ethanol plants that are producing cellulosic ethanol from corn kernel fiber. And they're selling that into the California market, but they're also able to get a financial incentive from the state of Minnesota. That concludes my presentation, and I am again very honored to be here and would be happy to answer questions that you may have.
Bob, thank you very much. Very interesting presentation. And we have time, I think, to take a few questions right now, and I'll lead off with the first one, if I may. Bob, this is more of a general question about the Upper Midwest. There's been some discussion and talk about a series of pipelines to collect carbon from the production of ethanol and to pipe that up to possibly the Bakken areas of North Dakota for underground storage. Is that a viable option, do you think? And could that ever come to fruition? And could we get together and do that in the states here in the Upper Midwest? What's your feeling on that?
I believe, thank you, Representative Anderson. I believe indeed that it is a possibility. There are at least two companies I've heard of that are pursuing this, and I believe I have a meeting on my schedule to meet with one of them. So they're pursuing this. One thing they're going to need to pay attention to in Minnesota, we one of the other parts of our responsibilities in my section actually is to examine impacts to farmland from energy projects, and the pipelines, including pipelines, transmission, oil pipelines, gas pipelines, and CO2 pipelines would also need to follow those rules. But thanks for the question.
Yeah, good point. I believe I read in Iowa there are discussions going on about easements and such, and talk of eminent domain. We don't want to go there either, of course, but it's something that is being discussed. Laura, Carolyn, any more questions on the way for Bob?
Yes, next, Senator Sweeney, would you unmute yourself and ask the question?
Found it. Okay. Sorry about that. I have probably a three-part question. How are we going to compete with all the incentives that the electric cars are getting? And are they going to then start, right now, E10 doesn't have any incentives. And it looks like Minnesota is really backing the ethanol industry. Here in Iowa, we've got a pushback on, upping our fuel levels like Minnesota has. And so the incentive for electric cars, the EPA also not honoring the small refinery waivers and the 2015 RFS. So the small refinery waivers really weren't for small refinery. The big guys just found the loophole. So how can we compete with all of those factors coming at us?
Excellent question, Senator. And well, as one of the things is that, as one of the earlier slides that I had showed, we're still going to have on the ground for quite a while, regardless of the level of incentives, a lot of internal combustion engines. And so for the short term, and short term being decades, we don't have much choice. The other thing, though, is that programs like a low carbon fuel standard have the prospect, if designed properly, to be a good incentive for the longer term for biofuels, not only for small engines, but for larger vehicles, for maritime, for aviation fuel, and those types of things. So that's, I think, for the long term, incentivizing innovation in the biofuel space is going to be able to, if we can do that, is going to be able to keep biofuels viable in the future.
Okay, we're going to take 2 more questions before we move to the next presentation. And first we have one from MLA Hugh Nerline.
Yes, good morning. Thank you. A couple of quick questions. One is, can you address the myth or reality of the food versus fuel argument that has been around for years with respect to the issues of if you're taking production out of the food marketplace and putting it into the fuel marketplace, it creates some anomalies in the food system. And the second one is, my understanding from talking to some of our ag producers, particularly in the northern areas, is that some of the current farm equipment manufacturing technology is not necessarily compatible with the proposed fuel standards, and it could and will cause some warranty issues. If you wouldn't mind addressing both of those. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome, sir. Regarding food versus fuel, it's a complicated topic. I think there are a lot of myths out there, and it relates to I think that's food versus fuel is kind of a shorthand for what's called their land use impacts of production, and that's a complicated issue. There is evidence that in the past production, a lot of it not in this country, caused some competition for land and destruction of rainforests and so forth. But that's really changed largely due to production improvements, efficiency improvements in plants, and a lot of advancements. Today, one of the things that's come up in debate here in regard to going up to E15 is just that of, will E15 cause a land rush essentially, and a lot of conversion of land. The feeling is that, though, that there's really plenty of corn production. We export a lot of corn and ethanol, and that shouldn't be a problem. There's some really complicated analysis that I wouldn't be able to explain in terms of land use that also I think suggests that that many of the concerns are exaggerated. On the farm equipment part, I don't really not knowledgeable on compatibility of farm equipment, but one thing I'll say about warranties, and I can't remember the name of the federal act, but essentially, for a warranty to not be honored, there has to be proof that of cause, essentially that the fuel caused the issue, and it can't just be speculation. So, and typically, biofuels, aren't being found to cause engine problems for the most part. So, hope that helps.
Thank you, Bob. We're going to take one final comment before moving to the next presentation, and that's going to be from Illinois Representative Noreen Hammond.
Thank you, Laura, very much. And Bob, thank you for this information. Illinois is just coming off passing a an energy bill that is certainly controversial. And you mentioned the challenge of eminent domain, and part of what was included in the bill that passed in Illinois included a for Grain Belt Express, which is coming from Indiana, high voltage electric transmission line coming from Indiana over to Kansas and runs through 7 counties, excuse me, in South Central Illinois. It is the first time ever that a private energy company has been granted the possibility of eminent domain in much of that agricultural land, and it is not a good precedent to set. And I am extremely concerned about it and what the outcome will be.
Right. Well, yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's very interesting. Here in Minnesota, actually, private energy companies do have eminent domain power, and so that's a routine thing here. They're regulated by the Public Utilities Commission, and thankfully there was statute passed in 2005 that gave us, it's not regulatory power, but it gives the Department of Agriculture essentially advisory capacity to the Public Utilities Commission on impacts to agricultural land from energy projects. So we routinely comment and are listened to, thankfully, by the Public Utilities Commission. But yeah, one thing that I think is ignored a little bit, for example, in the EV discussion, is the amount of transmission capacity that is going to be needed to be able to support that, which will mean more high voltage transmission lines not only crossing farmland, but being near people's houses and that sort of thing. So there are, even with the green solutions, there are some impacts. So.
Well, thank you again, Bob. Thanks for your presentation, and also thank you for your work in Minnesota. It's very much appreciated.
Pleasure.
And we can return to more questions for Bob later in the meeting, but right now we're going to turn things over to one of my fellow committee members, Kansas Senator Marcy Francisco, who will lead us to the next couple of presentations. And to take it away, Senator Francisco.
Thank you, Representative Anderson. Our next presenter is Troy Bradenkamp, who is the Senior Vice President of Government and Public Affairs at the Renewable Fuels Association. Previously, Troy served as the Executive Director of Renewable Fuels Nebraska, the trade association for Nebraska's ethanol producers. He also has experience working for the Nebraska Rural Electric Association, the Colorado Farm Bureau, and the American Farm Bureau Federation in Washington, D.C. Troy is a native of York, Nebraska, where he was raised on a 500-acre diversified farm operation, still owned by his family. He's a graduate of the University of Nebraska at Lincoln, and welcome to one of my neighbors from the north.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate this opportunity. I am from Nebraska, so I have to give a quick shout out to my home state senators, Dorn and Sanders. Hope everything's well back in the Good Life state. We used to call it the Cornhusker state, but until we start learning how to play football again, I'm going to stick with the Good Life state. I'm going to cover a lot of ground in a short period of time, so we will hopefully answer some of these questions, but also if you have questions at the end, please let me know and we will try and get those addressed. So next slide. Just a little bit about RFA. We are the National Trade Association for America's Ethanol Producers. We represent companies that operate about 60 ethanol plants, biorefineries, as we like to call them, here in the US. Our members also include biofuel advocates, technology providers, farmers, and others that contribute to the value chain. We're celebrating our 40-year anniversary this year. We're happy about that. We've been around since 1981, and we certainly hope for another successful 40 years. Next slide. Representative Anderson did a really good job of kind of laying out where the industry is, but here's a graphic that shows it on a map where those ethanol plants are. That number for 2020 can vacillate a little bit, so his number may not mirror this exactly, but you can see that growth over the last 20 years from 2000 to 2020 has been significant, and a lot of that growth is in large part due to many of the state incentives that were put in place by those states to attract that technology and those businesses to those states. I know that's the case for my home state of Nebraska, and I know it's the case for other states as well. Next slide. Again, Representative Anderson covered quite a bit of this slide, so I won't belabor a lot of those points, but just keep in mind 5 billion bushels of corn begins its processing at an ethanol plant. I say begins the processing because all we are really doing is harvesting the starch from that corn kernel. The rest of it goes back into that food chain as a feed additive and some other things. So we don't hopefully see a food versus fuel issue. It's a food and fuel thing for an ethanol plant. He talked about those direct and indirect jobs. I want to talk a little bit about the weathering of the storms that we've seen coming at us over the last 3 years. One person mentioned the small refinery exemptions. Certainly they have been an issue for us. RVOs not being met because of that. The delay in getting a renewable volume obligation from EPA has been a problem as well. Certainly the issue we've had with E15 and getting year-round E15 has been problematic. And then COVID. Obviously the impact COVID has had on the industry has been significant. Our number for indirect losses were about $5 billion to the ethanol industry nationwide because of COVID. And we're still about 200,000 barrels a day that remain offline. That's either due to they just couldn't come back from the losses that they incurred, or they've moved over to industrial uses. So our goal at RFA is and our focus is going to be to rebuild and fortify the renewable fuel standard, because that is the base. That is the ground floor for what we're trying to do, and then explore other opportunities. Those include low carbon, new uses, and obviously exports. Next slide. This is just that same information in a different view. One thing I would like to point out here, though, is that our industry does attract military veterans. We're very proud of that. 1 in 5 of our employees are from the military, and that's more than triple what the national average is. So we're happy for that, and we continue to support those folks. Next slide. This is a slide that shows that growth in gallons over the years, going all the way back to the beginning of RFA in 1981. You can see significant growth in the early and mid 2000s. That was because of the renewable fuel standard, and that growth continued up until 2018, when we pretty much capped out at our 15 billion gallon max under the RFS for corn-based ethanol. You've seen a little retraction in 2019. That's those small refinery exemptions that were being allowed for or granted under the Trump administration. And then 2020 number, that's that significant downturn due mostly to COVID. Next slide. Want to talk to you a little bit about state activities that we see going on around the nation. Clearly, we have lots of states that are exploring or passing legislation dealing with some sort of a low carbon fuel standard or a clean fuel standard, as Bob referred to it as. We have a lot of data coming out of California. That's a 10-year-old low carbon fuel standard. That policy continues to ratchet to get lower and lower carbon emissions across all of the energy sources. Initially, that was touted as an electric vehicle component, but I think it's interesting to point out that over 80% of the low carbon fuel standard reductions in California have been met by biofuels. And so I think we've really proven ourselves, and I think we will continue to prove ourselves as time moves forward. Oregon and Washington have obviously done some recent and what we would consider probably a little more reasonable low carbon fuel standards. They've imposed those over the last year or so. Other states look at clean fuel policy. Bob mentioned Minnesota. I know New Mexico is working on language as well, many other states. There's also a Midwest clean fuels policy standard that is being discussed. And I think that's a good discussion to be had. One thing that I do want to point out is, and something we want to avoid, is the banning of internal combustion engine vehicles, like the governor of California did earlier this year. That is not something we want to see happen. There needs to be pushback on that. The focus should be on carbon reduction and not picking a technology over the other. We certainly want a technology neutral approach if that's the carbon reduction plan you're going to move forward with, but don't ban something that we can obviously decarbonize. And I'll show you that as this presentation moves forward. There's other states that are looking at ways to expand E15. We lost that year-round E15 due to a court decision. Unfortunately, we know states are looking at doing it within state government purview. I know Iowa and Ohio made some attempts. Other states are exploring ways to opt out of the 1 pound waiver. The E15 plan was to expand E10 waivers to E15. That's what the court said we couldn't do. But another option under the Clean Air Act is to just do away with the 1 pound waiver for E10. That would put that RVP responsibility back onto the refinery to deliver a Bob fuel that would be 1 pound lower coming in, so that the requirement to blend the ethanol would still have to be met there. Iowa's Governor Reynolds is leading an effort with multiple state governors to sign a letter and ask the EPA what it would take to opt out of that program. I know that letter is being circulated right now. I thank Governor Walz for the last one that I know as of yesterday getting on that letter. So it's now a bipartisan letter, and we're looking for others to get on that letter as well, just to indicate there is interest in the Midwest to make sure that we have year-round E15. And that's one way that we could do it with that opt-out option. So keep that in mind. Next slide. Want to talk a little bit more in depth about this near-term decarbonization option. This again is data coming out of California. That top red line is where gasoline is, or E0. It's actually gone up. It's actually gotten worse from a carbon footprint perspective over time. Meanwhile, the ethanol impact is continuing to lower and decarbonize that fuel in California. The orange line down at the bottom is the introduction of corn kernel fiber or cellulosic ethanol, and that's got a really low carbon intensity. Bob did a good job of explaining what CI is. So when you see that 65 and that 58, that's a carbon intensity as compared to E0 or 100 carbon points. So ethanol has done a great job in California, and we will continue to tout that as that program moves forward. Next slide. Opportunities. I want to spend a little bit of time on this slide. There's a lot of information here, but I think it's something that I think we all can get excited about moving forward. There's a lot of legislation being talked about out here in Washington, D.C. regarding ethanol and biofuels. One of those is the Next Generation Fuels Act. This is a high octane approach and a low carbon approach to a better fuel mix moving forward. There's low carbon fuel standard or clean fuel standard legislation that is being talked about. I know we are in the process of talking to many people on Capitol Hill about what it would take to have that carbon-based technology neutral tax credit approach to fuels moving forward. We have incentives coming in higher blend infrastructure. The package that is before Congress right now, the Build Back Better plan has about $1 billion in there for higher blend infrastructure. We're pretty happy about that. We weren't able to get the flex fuel vehicle incentives in that package that we were looking for, but those are also important to keep moving forward on. The only way we get to higher blends is if we get flex fuel vehicles being made again. And for whatever reason, primarily the incentives aren't there to have the auto manufacturers to be making flex fuel vehicles. So that's something that we're working to turn around. Then obviously we're going to need a solution for year-round E15. That could either come from a legislative approach, that's a pretty steep hill to climb right now, or a regulatory approach. We could go back to the EPA and have a nationwide 1 pound waiver opt-out. And so that's something that we're talking about doing. We're talking a lot about carbon, and I think that's something everyone's going to have to get used to, because it is really something that continues to kind of drive the conversation. There is a global movement to decarbonize the energy and transportation sector, and I'm not asking those folks on this call to believe in global warming or climate change, but I think you ought to know that there's an economic opportunity here for ethanol to play a significant role in decarbonizing the energy and transportation sector. And I think it's an opportunity for us that we have to be ready for. Corn-based ethanol could be carbon negative in the coming decades. RFA's members have committed to a 70% carbon reduction by 2030. We think this is totally possible, and a net zero ethanol production by 2050. And again, we would not have agreed to this if we didn't think we could do that. It's going to require technology at the plant, but it's also going to be on-farm activities, carbon accounting, carbon capture has been mentioned here. That's going to be important. Yes, that pipeline is possible and would make a huge difference for those plants that are able to put their CO2 into that from a carbon intensity perspective on their ethanol. All these things coming together are going to be very important for us to be able to hit that net zero mark. So where could decarbonizing lead the industry to? Well, there's a lot of things going on out there. Biorefining, every product that we can make at a petrochemical plant can be made at a biorefinery. And if you can do that from a carbon neutral or a net zero perspective, then those products are going to continue to get more and more valuable, and there will be premiums paid for those things. You hear a lot about hydrogen and hydrogen fuel cells. Well, amazingly, ethanol has a lot of hydrogen in it, and so it's been known as a great hydrogen donator or generator for hydrogen fuel cell technology. Sustainable aviation fuel. If you've not heard of sustainable aviation fuel, or SAF, you will very soon. Again, in the Build Back Better plan, there is much language in there to incent the development of sustainable aviation fuel. And a lot of that is going to have, in order to get the numbers that they are looking at in terms of quantities of sustainable aviation fuel, it will require grain-based biofuels to help meet that mark. So we're doing a lot of work on alcohol to ethanol, or ethanol, alcohol to jet fuel. It is completely possible, and it would pay a tremendous premium down the road. And then I'll even throw out ethanol to electrons. Senator Dorn and Sanders know that Nebraska is an all public power state. We've already started having conversations with public power utilities there to talk about using ethanol as a backup source for making electricity directly. This is something that, as ethanol continues to lower its CI score, it's going to become more and more attractive as a potential backup generation for wind, for solar. Ethanol can be aerosolized to where it looks and mimics natural gas, so it could go in a peaker plant. There's all kinds of options here and opportunities, particularly in the Midwest, as a backup source for other renewable electric generation sources for ethanol to play a huge role. So we're pretty excited about what's out there, what the opportunities are. Next slide. This gets into a little bit more of how that CI calculation takes place. If you look at where we're at right now, we are about 50% reduction in carbon intensity versus gasoline today. In 2 to 5 years, we think that number is going to get completely better. Like I said, by 2030, we think we can be at a 70% reduction. And then obviously by 2050, we completely think we could be at a net zero carbon generation. And the way that looks on this slide is you take what's above the line with the credits going below the line, and you add those together, and that's where you get to a net zero ethanol fuel opportunity. So we're excited about where this might happen and where that might lead us down the road as, again, the globe continues to decarbonize that energy and transportation sector. Next slide. There's a lot of conversation about EVs versus liquid fuels. And again, we don't think it's an either or, we think it's an and. We certainly see an opportunity here for hybrid flex fuel tech, for flex fuel technology to be paired up with hybrid technology, so that if you have a plug-in hybrid vehicle that is E85 compliant, now you're really talking about a vehicle that could be charging almost 100% on renewable energy from the electric side, and then 85% from the liquid fuel side. So these are the kinds of things that we are promoting. Toyota looks to be one of a promising partner to develop this kind of biofuel, flex fuel, low emissions vehicle type concept with an electric vehicle. And if you look at that high octane flex fuel vehicle plug-in hybrid, and you compare it to an all EV battery, there's a lot of similar greenhouse gas emissions comparisons. So we think we're in the ballpark, and that's something we're going to continue to promote long term. Next slide. Bob mentioned, kind of where things look long term. This is kind of that graph out there in a visual sense. Even the federal government, for all that they're talking about from an electric vehicle perspective, the Energy Information Administration is still telling us that liquid fuels will continue to dominate the transportation sector through 2050. And if you look at the far right side of this slide, you're going to see that in 2050, you're still going to have 11 to 12 million vehicles a year being sold from a liquid fuel perspective. So this early adoption, or this rapid adoption of electric vehicles, may not be as robust as what everyone wants you to think it is. Case in point is California. California is experiencing about a 20 to 25% return rate on electric vehicles, meaning that 25% of those being sold are being returned. And those are from the early adopters, from the true believers. And the main reason given to them about going back to liquid fuel is the hassle factor. It is a hassle, and liquid fuel is easier. And if we can decarbonize liquid fuel, like we think from a biofuels perspective we can, then I think there needs to be a long range future for a liquid fuel low carbon option from auto manufacturers moving forward. So those are just some things we're looking at from a transportation sector. You're going to start to then see jet fuel play a bigger role. Those are areas that are not easily electrified. They know that. And so that's why you're going to see a lot of biofuel to jet fuel conversations happening over the next 2 to 5 years. Next slide. I'll leave you with this. This is my last slide, and I'll talk a little bit about public sentiment. RFA does polling on a quarterly basis through Morning Consult, a national firm. This was the latest that we got from our September polling. And it should speak well to you elected leaders out there from the Midwest. What we found was that approximately 2/3 of the voters agree that ethanol should be a part of the strategy to achieve zero emissions vehicle economy-wide by 2050. We saw huge numbers in terms of 7 in 10 voters want to see diversified American fuel supply. So that tells me we don't need to should not be putting all of our eggs in one basket, that being electric vehicle, battery electric vehicle. And then they certainly believe that fuels and biofuels, and in particular ethanol, can play a role in helping price spikes that come from disasters or even from an oil spike like what we're seeing today. So those are important things to keep in mind as you guys move forward in making policy at the state level. My final slide is just, next slide, is just talking about where you can reach us. A lot of the fact sheets, we have a fact sheet for every state. You can go to ethanolrfa.org to find a lot of that information. We've got a fact sheet on food versus fuel there, and then the social media platforms that you can plug in and have a conversation with us. With that, I am done and be happy to answer any questions.
So Troy, thank you so much for that information-packed presentation. So we have a time for a few questions before our final presentation. Laura, Carolyn, are there questions and comments?
Yes, I just wanted to make sure that everybody had seen the question from Iowa Senator Annette Sweeney about where California gets their ethanol from and whether it comes from the Midwest. And Josh Rowe did type an answer in for us and saying that virtually all of California's ethanol comes from the states of Nebraska, Kansas, Iowa, and Minnesota. And I just wanted to see if Senator, if you had a follow-up to that, Senator Sweeney, and also Troy, if you wanted to comment on that at this point.
Josh is absolutely correct. Josh knows as well as I that fuel, the ethanol that California uses to meet their LCFS is coming from the Midwest, and it's from the low CI ethanol that is being produced in Kansas and Nebraska. The reason those states have really capitalized on that is because they have cattle feeding very nearby. So there is no drying of the distillers or the byproducts coming out the back. That is part of that scoring process. So they naturally have lower carbon intensity ethanol. That's an attractive thing and pays a premium going into that California market. Unless there's boats coming up from Brazil, depending on the RIN price and what that spread looks like, you're going to see almost all of the ethanol coming into California coming from the Midwest.
Thank you. This is Senator Sweeney. Thank you for your answer.
Thank you. And Senator Francisco, I think we'll move on to our final presenter.
So thank you again, Troy. Our next presenter is Josh Rowe. He joins us from the Kansas Corn Growers Association, where he is Vice President of Marketing Development and Policy. I know him best from his time previously as the Deputy Secretary at the Kansas Department of Agriculture, because he spent a great deal of time in our Senate Ag and Natural Resources Committee meetings. Prior to holding that position as Deputy Secretary, he was an agricultural economist at Kansas State University. At the Department of Agriculture, he was responsible for state and federal legislative policy and market development. Josh represents the 7th generation in his family to own and operate their family farm and continues to play an active role in managing that farm. Josh is going to talk about the economic impact of ethanol and the opportunities of ethanol as a renewable fuel. Thank you very much for joining us, Josh. I'll now turn it over to you.
Yeah, so, all right. Thank you so much, Senator, and everyone for just great questions and feedback through this. So I just have a few slides to share today. I wanted to just start out with kind of some feedstock things, that being corn, and show how, it's just kind of obvious as we've gotten more efficient in the ag industry, how that's really flowed into things like ethanol. I really look at Kansas's corn sustainability story over the last 50 years as being just remarkably successful. Corn production has increased fivefold, 515% over this time, but while acreage on corn, just 336%. So you'd look at that math there and it just shows that we've reduced the amount of land required to produce a bushel of corn by 44%. And then probably most important of all, soil erosion decreased about 58%. It's just been a neat story to see as a farmer, someone in the industry, and it's there. And, you know, just kind of personally, my personal story, I looked at when growing up, kind of my dad's era. You know, we produced a lot of corn and we fed it directly to our livestock, which is a great value added use for corn. But it's been amazing as we've had local ethanol production. We're able to, first and foremost, kind of gotten double the yields on the same acre of corn, thanks to advances in technology. And that had the chance to sell that corn to an ethanol plant. They pull 2.7 gallons of fuel off that, and a lot of times sending that fuel to California. And then we're still purchasing the byproduct, the wet distiller's grain of that. So that really is a really neat sustainability story that I get to be a part of every day. Some environmental benefits before we talk a little bit about the economics there. You know, I just want to remind, I think both presenters really talked about that carbon intensity score of ethanol. That really is, it's taken into account every ounce or every milligram of carbon that is generated throughout the whole process. That counts for, you know, not only raising the corn, but the carbon consumed in getting those inputs to my farm and producing those inputs, from getting that corn from, you know, from my field to the end market. And so and then on through the ethanol process and out the tailpipe of that vehicle. And, you know, I'm not here to, you know, debate or bash any other forms of propulsion that have been made known, but that same level of scrutiny is just frankly not applied to other forms of transportation or vehicle propulsion. We're there. Great, you know, study released by Harvard researchers, Harvard Tufts University concluded that, you know, ethanol reduced greenhouse gas emissions and carbon intensity by 50% compared to straight unleaded gasoline. And then the other thing that's worth mentioning is, you know, the carbon intensity is 50% lower from, you know, ethanol to what a typical gasoline blend is. But as we increase these ethanol blends, when you go from your E0 to an E10 to E15, when you're getting that source of octane from ethanol, what you're replacing is, if you will, some of the worst parts of gasoline tended to be some of those aromatics that have the most, you know, they're the worst offenders in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. So at the margin, the improvements are even better than what you'd think. So, you know, that does vary by where you're at in the United States compared to what the base blend stock of the gasoline is, but it's something worth noting. Economic benefits, it's something I could talk all day on through here. I'm going to highlight just some Kansas specific stats, and obviously knowing that compared to some states on here, Kansas is a lot smaller ethanol producer, but you could just multiply these by your factor that's in your own state. If I look at Kansas, we're, you know, just producing about 600 million gallons of ethanol. And that's consuming, you know, depending on the year, about 30% of Kansas's corn crop. The nationwide average is right at 35% as where we're at. Each one of these plants employs an average of 45 people with an average salary of $59,000. So this is just not quite double what our median income is in the state of Kansas for the average plant employee. Troy mentioned the veterans. It's just a neat story through that. And then also worth pointing out, a lot of these plants being in rural areas, they have a lot lower median income. So, you know, a job at the ethanol plant can be, you know, well more than double with that. And then a lot of times the ethanol plant is among one of the top property tax payers in the county through that. And so that's that base thing. And then from the other side, you know, we have the ag benefits, we have benefits from the plant, but it's really important to remember the consumer benefits that happen here. You know, we all see E10 prices are 20 to 40 cents below E0. You know, we'll see that on the fuel pumps from time to time, that ethanol-free gasoline or whatever, however they market it. And sometimes I think that's a really good ethanol commercial, because it's common to see in spots of Kansas where that E0 or that fuel that says ethanol free, it might be 40 cents higher than what the 87 E10 fuel is. So it saves producers or consumers money. And then going up one level, a lot of talk of E15. You know, Kansas has seen those growths, and Kansas Corn has made those investments as well. You know, E15 it's compatible with all vehicles 2001 and newer. It's EPA approved for, and so that represents over 90% of the vehicles on the road today. And it's in general priced 5 to 10 cents below E10. What's neat is, especially in newer, more higher compression engine vehicles, you just do not see that reduction in miles per gallon that you see in maybe some of the older vehicles as you increase that. So it makes really good economic sense, and then can be even more so as you go to, with flex fuel vehicles, higher level blends of ethanol. We've got a set of fuel retail stations in Kansas, very successful at selling E30 as a blend. And it's just amazing what that does for the reduction in price and actually increase in miles per gallon for compatible vehicles through there. Couple things I wanted to point out when I really look at some long-term economic benefits I see from ethanol. The state of California has been mentioned with their low carbon fuel standard through that. It's generating a lot of credit. So here on the left side of this panel, this is a picture I took here towards the end of July. I had a chance with several of my counterparts. We went out and worked with some fuel retailers in California. So this is a fuel station that's in southern San Diego. Actually, we're probably like 8 miles from the Mexican border where we're at here. You see their regular 87 E10 that day was selling for $4.15, and E85, so fuel containing 85% ethanol, was selling for $1.75. So because of that, you see E85, California is one of the top markets or purchasers of E85 just because of this incredible price spread that we're seeing. So it's sustained 27.5% growth over the last 15 years. An amazing statistic when the 2020 numbers came out is E85 virtually held flat. E85 sales did in 2020, but as a whole, California motor gas demand fell 21%. And so what we see here at the bottom is a graph, and I'm happy I can share the reference behind this, but this is a projections actually put out by a study funded by the California Air Resources Board, or CARB. And this just shows the long-term demand for different fuel sources there. You see the blue line is just straight up gasoline. And as expected, as we get to 2045, they're virtually, through other mandates and electrification and that, they're really wanting to reduce that gasoline virtually to nothing. That next yellow line says BBG. It's called bio-based gasoline. That's their fancy term for the word ethanol. I guess ethanol is a negative connotation. You see where we were in 2020, just a little mark, that yellow mark. And this shows, and this isn't, a study funded by corn, ethanol groups, anything. This is from, the California Air Resources Board saying that look at that growth in bio-based gasoline occurring through 2045. So I see this as a very important market, really because of that. Actually, the states of Kansas, Nebraska, and Missouri have made some direct investments in market development for more development of fuel stations in California. And the ethanol groups, corn states, National Corn, RFA being one of them, has strongly invested in just doing some additional studies and testing required by the California government, the CARB board, to allow for the sale of E15. So that's that piece that we see. There's going to be some real specific markets like California, other states through there that I see as having that. And then just want to mention, Troy mentioned this as well. I see kind of overall a broader way that we could increase ethanol use in in the nation is through minimum octane standards. The one out there now, the Next Generation Fuels Act that the corn groups and some of the ethanol industry strongly supported. What that does is it, I mean, kind of first and foremost, it does mandate that beginning in model year 2026, automakers produce engines that are compatible or run on a high octane and 95 RON fuel. But really more importantly than that, what we're seeing a lot of, all you see, you know, when you look at TV, the next models of vehicles, and that is everything's just all about going to electric. And, you know, some of them are doing that for market and other reasons, but probably the pivotal reason behind that the automakers are doing this is the only lever or the only way that they have to comply with more stringent emission standards is by producing more electric vehicles. You know, they're not receiving the proper credits for producing flex fuel vehicles or for producing high compression engines that could run on high octane, low carbon fuels. That really is, and this really kind of resets, puts, you know, the internal combustion engine, an efficient internal combustion engine, on that same level playing field with the electric propulsion there. And so that's why this could be really important with that. And then it's worth, from an environmental standpoint, the estimates from University of Chicago state that the introduction of legislation or the passage of this legislation, it could result in reducing greenhouse gas emissions by over 1 billion tons compared to just our baseline scenario where there's fewer internal combustion engines, more electric vehicles on the road. If we kind of, you know, give the internal combustion engine this shot in the arm to make it more efficient, it will result in, you know, quite a few less greenhouse gas emissions. And then, of course, the argument, the fact of lower fuel costs for consumers. So that's another piece through there. And I think that's the end of my slide presentation through there. So happy to kind of catch us up on time and answer any other questions as they come up. Thank you.
So Josh, so good to see you.
Yeah.
And thank you very much for this presentation. Before we open up things for general discussion for all our presenters, we'll take some questions for you. As we do this, I'm going to turn things over to Indiana Representative Ethan Manning, and he's going to moderate the remaining questions and discussion with the help of Laura and Carolyn. They're monitoring both the chat and raised hands, so look forward to questions.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you, Senator Francisco, and thank you, Josh, for a great presentation. My wife is from Kansas, so good to be here with a couple of Kansans here. First, are there any questions for Josh from anyone? Carolyn, did we have some we were saving until after Josh spoke?
Yeah, and I think it's particular fitting right now. Randy, do you want to go ahead and make your comment or your question? Randy Stuckey?
Oh, well, hey, good morning, everybody. This is Randy Stuckey with the Renew Kansas Biofuels Association. And I had just responded to a couple of questions in the comment box. One was specifically about the carbon intensity score and how Kansas ethanol, Midwest ethanol, but certainly Kansas ethanol might be affected by how the carbon intensity score might be affected in Kansas. And a direct answer to that question is Kansas, like many other states, is currently planning on pursuing legislation to allow for carbon capture and sequestration, specifically sequestration in our geological formations in Kansas, where we have a geological structure that is ready-made for that. And we just have to amend a couple of statutes in Kansas law to set that up. And that has been addressed in a number of states in the Midwest in recent years, principally Nebraska, North Dakota, Oklahoma, and Louisiana. And we're excited about taking that next step and the effects of carbon sequestration on lowering the carbon intensity score of Kansas produced ethanol, but certainly all Midwest produced ethanol. And other states, they will pursue that through pipelines. We won't need to do that in Kansas because we have the geological structure and fortunate to have that in place to allow for sequestration. So that's a long-winded answer to that specific question about sequestration and the impacts on the carbon intensity score of Kansas produced ethanol.
And Josh, that's a question if I can bring to you. There was another question that when they do net zero, is carbon sequestration factored into the net zero?
Yeah, that plays a large role in getting ethanol to net zero. And it actually, that's big when we get to start talking about net negative ethanol, which gets really exciting.
All right, did we have one from Representative Eisenhart?
Yes, that's the next thing I was gonna say. I'm not sure if it's a question or a comment. Representative Eisenhart, did you have a comment or a question? I've asked him to unmute.
Sure, thank you. Just wanted to follow up on a statement that was made that we weren't trying to convince anyone of the reality of climate change, but it seems to be the underlying motivation for a lot of this work. And I just wanted to know if we were trying to send a unified message on that issue.
Anybody want to take that question or respond to the comment? We're into general discussion now, so. All right. And then we'll go to Representative Anderson.
You're muted, Representative.
Quick question. Thank you, Laura. Quick question for Josh. Really enjoyed your presentation. I was surprised to see the huge difference in price between E85 and gasoline, regular gas in California. Is there a public outcry or a push for more flex fuel vehicles out there because of that huge variation in price? Or what's the feeling out there for flex fuel vehicles?
Yeah, and thanks for the question. So the main reasons for that gap really are, it's not only the kind of the federal, the RIN price that the station owner can take advantage of, but then they're receiving additional credits through the LCFS system, because ethanol's got a very low CI score, because they buy as Troy mentioned, low carbon ethanol. So that's the other piece that they're really passing that on to the consumer. And yeah, there is, and that's unfortunate, because as a whole, automakers have less incentives to produce flex fuel vehicles. So we're seeing fewer new flex fuel vehicles on the road. So two things happening. A lot of people in that California sphere have been very helpful in helping to push for, reinstatement of flex fuel vehicles to get more produced. And then there's also some of those same line. There is, I know one private company in general that we've interacted with has a great product, and that is a really straightforward kit to convert any regular vehicle to a flex fuel vehicle. Costs $600 or even less, which would think about, especially for a rideshare driver, that it doesn't take very long to pay for that. And it's going through the regulatory process in tandem with the EPA and through the California Air Resources Board. You can purchase it. You can purchase the kits today, but really going through as a recognized alternative. So kind of seeing both ends of the spectrum being worked there in California.
All right, thank you, Josh. One last chance for questions.
The only thing I would like to bring up is a comment we put in the chat that John Deere and several other companies, including many of the corn organizations from the Midwest, are investing in developing a ethanol-driven high power engine to replace the diesel engine. And I think that if they can get that done, that will be an amazing opportunity. And then the other thing I think that's real important to bring up to this crowd, because they'll be interested in it, is in the program, in the infrastructure program, there is, if it passes, the one that is currently on docket today or this week or in maybe next week, it does include a $25 per acre cover crop payment, which would be huge for the Midwest. And I don't know if Josh or one of y'all, Josh, did you have a comment on that? I'm sure that's something that Kansas follows closely.
Yeah, absolutely. That's, anything that's kind of keeps getting the foot in the door to encourage lower carbon intensity farming practices as we can continue to document those, and as they're going through our end markets, it improves the overall CI score. It can be very, very helpful through that.
In addition to helping our water quality.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the other benefit through there. That's what, my family, we've been pretty active in cover crops for 5 or 6 years due to a variety of reasons through that. And it's a good double benefit.
So the MLC, will we continue to follow anything that comes out of those bills for our communities in the Midwest? We'll let you, Lord, I'll let you know as we find out more. That's all from me.
Hey, Carol,
All
this
right.
is Troy. The John Deere announcement is one everyone should keep their eyes on because that's exciting. It's not even a new engine. It's a diesel engine that's been modified, and that modification is not a big modification to actually run on E100. And so this could be huge. This is that backup generation aspect. If we could take diesel generation backup and replace that with ethanol, or even John Deere, powertrains and everything we use for the heavy duty sector could actually run on E100. That's an exciting opportunity for us. And that's one of those new uses that is going to have an opportunity with that lower carbon intensity that we're talking about.
I think we have a better option of that coming to the marketplace than self-driving vehicles in the Midwest. Because when I have snow on the ground, there's no way I can have a self-driving vehicle. But if I can have an ethanol running vehicle, we can make that work. So yeah, I think you're right, Troy, that has a great opportunity for the Midwest. Senator Francisco has a question.
Not a question, but a response to that earlier challenge about, how do we hone our message? And that message is really important because all of us in the Midwest want to support our farmers, our rural communities. This is a way to do it. So let's not trip ourselves up. Let's say, if the coasts want low carbon, we're here to help.
I like it, Senator Francisco. Thank you so much. And with that, I will turn it back over to close us out to my 2019 Build classmate, Representative Whitkey.
Before Representative Whitkey takes over, Senator Francisco and Senator McGinn are planning site visits for us. And one of the site visits for the Midwestern Legislative Conference in Kansas in July may be a brand new ethanol plant. Is that correct? That's what I've been told.
I understand that to be the case, and hope many of you can join us.
That was just my plug for the advertisement for the MLC annual meeting. Thank you.
And thank you, Representative Manning. I think there was a lot of great content in today's session. Talking about a message, I believe that is very clear for us here in Wisconsin. It appears that we have a little bit of work to do to catch up with some of our colleagues. And I know we just love exporting agricultural products out to either of the coasts. And one of our sessions, we've focused on producing a bill that will help us with that. So thank you to all our colleagues on the MLC Agriculture and Natural Resources Committee for co-hosting this event, and to all of our presenters and participants for taking time out of your day to join us. On behalf of the Economic Development Committee, we hope that you will continue to join us for other sessions in this series. The next 3 webinars are listed on the slide. On November 17th, we'll be joined by the MLC Education Committee for a session on youth apprenticeship programs. Another topic I believe those of us in states that have gaps in the workforce needs would appreciate the information on. Registration is open for that session. Just go to CSG Midwest website under events. You will also receive an email notification with the registration link. Looking ahead, we are also planning sessions on educational opportunities for incarcerated and ex-offender populations and on the childcare crisis and its impact on jobs in the economy. That being said, I will look forward to visiting a ethanol plant in Kansas, given the opportunity in our next conference. We hope you'll join us for all those future events. Thank you again for joining us today. And Laura will close us out. Laura, it's back to you.
I just want to reiterate my thanks to our presenters for all the time and effort they put into making this a successful event, and to all of you who participated in this and joined us today. Thank you to all the officers who made sure that this event ran smoothly. Appreciate all of your time and your efforts, and just want to wish everybody to have a great rest of your day and a nice weekend, and hope to see you on a future event. Thanks all.